Welcome. If you're tuning in, you're likely looking for a clearer picture on where things stand with ending the conflict in Ukraine.
Exactly. There's been a lot of noise, a lot of movement.
So, in this deep dive, we're really going to dig into the latest developments, especially statements from U.S. officials about peace talks.
And the big question we're tackling really is this. Is the U.S. about to pull back from peace efforts? Or is there still some optimism, some path forward for a negotiated solution?
Let's start with that sense of urgency. It feels quite palpable right now.
Oh, absolutely. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he made some pretty strong statements in Paris, basically warning that the U.S. could wrap up its efforts, its current push, within just days if there's no real movement.
Days? That's incredibly soon. How did he frame that?
He put it as needing to figure out very quickly if a resolution is actually doable. Is this even possible right now?
Okay, but there was some clarification, right? A U.S. official stepped in.
Yeah, they did. They clarified Rubio meant moving on from the negotiations specifically, not necessarily abandoning Ukraine altogether, but shifting away from this particular diplomatic track if it stalls.
That's an important distinction, I suppose. But still, days signals intense pressure.
It really does. Though, interestingly, we heard from a source familiar with the talks who offered a slightly different angle.
Oh, what did they say?
They suggested Rubio was essentially voicing President Trump's stance. But, and this is the interesting part, they believe Trump actually has, quote, limitless patience for the usual political maneuvering, the posturing, and play games.
Limitless patience, that seems almost the opposite of Rubio's message.
Well, yes and no. The source also stressed that the underlying message is serious. It's time to get serious. So maybe it's a tactic. Public pressure, private patience. Or maybe just pushing hard now.
So what's the concrete step they've taken, this framework?
Right. The U.S. has apparently put forward a broad framework, presented it to both Kiev and Moscow.
The idea being to see if they can bridge the gap, find some common ground fast.
Exactly. Rubio talked about it with Ukrainian officials for them to take back to Zelensky, and he also brought it up with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov.
Okay, but what if this quick check fails? What if there's no movement? Are there fallback plans?
Well, that's where potential policy shifts come in. President Trump has floated the idea of secondary sanctions, even tariffs targeting Russia.
The secondary sanctions, those can hit other countries trading with Russia, right? Broaden the economic pain.
Precisely. And there's also been talk about the U.S. not funding Ukraine indefinitely, urging Europe to contribute more, pushing allies to step up.
Meanwhile, how's Russia responding? We heard negotiations stalled.
Yeah, reports indicate talks haven't progressed much from their side, and they apparently rejected a ceasefire proposal from Ukraine earlier.
And President Trump's view, he initially said he could end it in a day.
His more recent comments suggest frustration, saying things like, Russia has to get moving. So the tone seems to have shifted a bit there, too.
But wasn't there some positive news recently? Talks involving the U.S., Ukraine, and Europeans?
Yes, last Thursday. The State Department called it an excellent exchange. There was even some talk about progress on a minerals deal between the U.S. and Ukraine.
A minerals deal. Okay, that's specific. But does progress there mean progress on peace?
Not necessarily. That's the thing. You can have these positive side discussions, but the big picture, ending the actual fighting, that still seems quite far off, unfortunately.
And that partial ceasefire we talked about before, the one on energy infrastructure?
That expired. It was brokered by the U.S., but it's over now. And frankly, even while it was supposedly active, both sides were constantly accusing each other of breaking it.
Which just shows the level of mistrust, doesn't it? Makes any agreement incredibly fragile.
Definitely. It really highlights the challenge. But it's not all pessimism. We heard a different tune from Vice President J.D. Vance just hours after Rubio's comments.
Oh, right, Vance in Rome. What was his take?
Much more optimistic. He actually said he felt optimistic that the administration will successfully negotiate an end to the war.
Really? That's quite a contrast. Did he give any specifics?
Not publicly. He mentioned having interesting things to report on privately about the negotiations and just expressed this hopeful feeling about bringing the brutal war to a close.
So conflicting signals from the top. Rubio's urgency, Vance's optimism. What should listeners make of that?
It could be different aspects of the strategy, maybe managing expectations, maybe just different personal perspectives. It's hard to say for sure, but the contrast is definitely there.
Let's dig into those Paris talks more. The U.S. presented an outline, you said?
Yes, a U.S.-authored outline for a peace plan. The State Department said it got an encouraging reception there.
Encouraging, okay. But no details released.
No, not publicly. We just know it was shared in Paris, and Rubio also gave it to Lavrov.
And Rubio himself said the point of the Paris trip was what exactly?
He said it was to begin to talk about more specific outlines of what it might take to end the war, and crucially, to figure out if it can be ended, to gauge the possibility.
And he was pretty blunt about the alternative.
Very blunt. He said if it looks impossible, President Trump is probably at a point where he's going to say, we're done.
Wow. And he added that line, it's not our war.
Yes, it's not our war. We didn't start it. The United States has been helping Ukraine for the past 3 years, and we want it to end, but it's not our war. It definitely frames it as assistance with limits.
He also mentioned the time invested, right? 87 days.
Yeah, framing it as President Trump spending 87 days actively trying to end the war, signaling significant effort, but also implying that, a decision point is coming soon on whether it's even possible.
Okay, let's switch perspective. What about Russia's view on all this diplomacy? The Paris meetings involved quite a few players.
They did. On the U.S. side, you had Rubio, plus Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Special Representative Keith Kellogg. Ukraine sent senior figures like Andrei Yermak, Andrei Sybiha, Rustem Umerov, and French President Macron was involved too.
A high-level group.
Yeah.
And how was it characterized publicly?
Generally as productive, aiming for both a ceasefire and a lasting peace. Macron even posted on X about a positive and constructive discussion and Europe's commitment to working with the U.S.
And Ukraine's position in those talks.
Yermak emphasized the need for the fullest ceasefire, reminding everyone that Ukraine had agreed to one back on March 11th in Jeddah. So, reiterating their willingness, at least on paper.
What's next then? More talks.
Europe is planning more talks in London next week, but it's unclear if the U.S. will participate.
Why the uncertainty?
Well, Tammy Bruce from the State Department said the U.S. isn't interested in just having meetings about meetings. They seem to want substance, not just process.
So Rubio briefed Lavrov after Paris.
Yes, conveyed the substance and Washington's desire for the war to end. The State Department put out a statement saying the encouraging reception in Paris suggests peace is possible if everyone commits.
And Moscow's official reaction?
The Russian Foreign Ministry said the meeting fit within their ongoing consultations, mentioning Witkoff's previous visit to St. Petersburg. They stated they're ready to keep working with the U.S. to, quote, reliably eliminate the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis.
Which sounds like standard diplomatic language, keeping the door open.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It confirms channels are open, dialogue is happening, even amidst all the pressure.
Okay, let's circle back to that moratorium on energy infrastructure strikes. It expired April 17th.
That's the date Russia set, yes. It followed that Putin-Trump call on March 18th.
And the Kremlin isn't extending it automatically.
No. They said no instructions were given to extend it, and no specific foreign consultations were happening on that point right now. A Kremlin aide, Ushakov, basically said it needs to be discussed specifically with the U.S., and Russia would send a certain signal about what comes next.
But Ukraine had a different start date in mind.
Right. Kiev saw it starting later March 25th, after those indirect negotiations in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So depending on who you ask, the timing is different.
And again, lots of accusations of violations during that period.
Constantly, from both sides, which really undermines the whole concept.
And Russia's UN rep, Nebenzia, he basically said a full ceasefire is unrealistic right now.
Yes, pointing directly to that limited energy ceasefire not being observed, in his view, as proof that a broader one wouldn't hold either. It shows deep skepticism about enforceability.
These Paris talks were significant because they brought Europe into the direct talks with the new U.S. admin in Ukraine, right?
Exactly. First time for that specific configuration on a potential settlement. Before, Europe's involvement in the formal U.S.-Russia consultations seemed more limited.
Kellogg had said before that Europeans wouldn't be at the table initially, but their interests would be considered.
Phil's line earlier, yes. But now we see Macron involved directly in Paris. And in the background, Macron and UK's Keir Starmer are trying to build this coalition of the willing.
For what purpose?
To develop long-term security guarantees for Ukraine. There's even been talk among allies, Canada, Australia, Turkey included, about maybe sending peacekeepers to monitor a ceasefire if one is reached.
Peacekeepers, that's a big step. But what about U.S. backing for that? Security guarantees from Washington?
That's the sticking point. Macron and Starmer have tried to persuade President Trump, but so far, no firm public commitment from the U.S. on security guarantees for Ukraine or for a potential mission like that.
What did Rubio say about guarantees after Paris?
He said the U.S. isn't ready to talk specifics publicly yet, but he did say he thought the UK, France, and Germany could play a key role in advancing the settlement process itself. Suggests maybe a European lead on that aspect.
Interesting. Okay, what about European expectations from these talks? What were they hoping for or worried about?
Reports suggest the U.S. side in Paris was pushing for a full ceasefire within weeks, a very ambitious timeline.
And the Europeans on board.
They confirmed they're ready to work together, but they also apparently asked the U.S. team, okay, what happens if we don't see progress in weeks? What's the plan then?
And they pushed for a tougher stance on Russia.
Yes, reportedly urging Washington to follow through on that threatened large-scale sanctions package, specifically mentioning the secondary tariffs on Russian oil if Russia is seen as blocking a ceasefire. They want more pressure.
But not everyone was convinced Paris achieved much. Le Monde was critical.
Yes, the French paper suggested no real progress was made. And they specifically raised concerns about Special Envoy Witkoff, alleging his position is too close to Russia's.
What specifically did they claim about Witkoff's position?
That he sees the main issue as the future status of Crimea and the other occupied regions, DNR, LNR, Zaporizhia, Kherson. Reuters even reported he suggested Trump support giving Russia ownership of those territories.
Which ties into what Zelensky said before Paris, accusing Witkoff of spreading Russian narratives.
Exactly. Le Monde's diplomatic source contrasted Witkoff with Rubio, saying Rubio gets the European and Ukrainian view better, while Witkoff is just focused on starting talks with Russia almost at any cost.
And there's still disagreement on who would actually monitor a ceasefire?
Big disagreement. Ukraine doesn't want the OSCE or the UN. They want the U.S. to take that role. But Washington hasn't committed. So a fundamental piece of any ceasefire plan is still up in the air.
Let's talk sanctions relief. Rubio said Europe has to be involved there.
Absolutely. Because many sanctions are European. The U.S. can't lift them alone. So any deal involving sanctions relief needs European buy-in.
And are Ukraine and Europe ready to offer relief?
They've been very clear. No hasty lifting of restrictions. The Elysee Palace statement after Paris confirmed sanctions were discussed, but the focus was on using them for leverage, not easing them yet.
There was also that report about aviation sanctions.
Right. Politico reported Russia is talking to the U.S. about getting those lifted. But the EU is resisting, apparently due to both political reasons and real safety concerns about how Russian planes have been maintained under sanctions.
Okay, bringing it back to the immediate timeline, President Trump said he expects an answer from Russia this week.
Yes, specifically on a possible truce. He mentioned this during a briefing with Italian PM Giorgia Meloni present.
And Meloni voiced support.
Yes, she talked about working together for a just and lasting peace and supported Trump's efforts. But of course, settling the Ukraine conflict was a major campaign promise for Trump.
So just to recap that ceasefire timeline, Ukraine agreed to one March 11th if Russia did too.
Correct. But then Putin raised questions about arms supplies, mobilization, training. Then came the separate 30-day moratorium on energy strikes after the Trump-Putin call March 18th.
Which Zelensky initially supported.
He did. But then came the accusations of violations from Moscow. And now that moratorium period is technically over, or its status is uncertain, pending discussion with the U.S.
And Trump's current take is both sides want it, but Moscow's dragging its feet.
That seems to be his public assessment, along with that standing threat of secondary oil tariffs if Russia is deemed responsible for inaction.
And there was even talk of a truce being announced in May.
A possibility floated by someone on Ukraine's Parliamentary Security Committee. It fits the U.S. view that a temporary ceasefire is sort of step one, the necessary precursor to real substantive negotiations to end the war itself.
So, wrapping this all up for our listeners, what's the main takeaway? It feels like a moment of high pressure, maybe even a tipping point.
I think that's fair. The U.S., particularly through Rubio, is signaling a very short fuse for the current diplomatic push. President Trump's administration seems ready to change tack if a breakthrough doesn't happen, well, almost immediately.
But at the same time, you have Vance expressing optimism, ongoing talks, European involvement.
Exactly. It's complex. There are these contrasting signals, and underneath it all, European partners have their own serious concerns and perspectives, especially on crucial issues like security guarantees and what happens with sanctions down the line. It's definitely a critical juncture.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.